Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about muscle blood flow and metabolism. So muscle blood flow during exercise is regulated by a lot of different factors. So the exact mechanisms and how those different factors interact and work together isn't entirely clear. The mechanisms that regulate blood flow are likely redundant because experimentally, if we interfere with one of the mechanisms, we still have normal blood flow to that muscle or to whatever muscle is being studied. So there isn't a great effect when one mechanism is interfered with because those mechanisms are probably redundant. Now, in this context, when we say redundant, that's not a bad thing. It just means that there are lots of different pathways, lots of different ways that we achieve the same goal. So if one is faulty or something goes wrong, then we still are able to achieve the same goal. So in cases like this, redundancy is a benefit, not a problem. Sympathetic stimulation causes vasoconstriction in whatever areas of the body are not the priority during that exercise state. So if we think about fight or flight, so our sympathetic stimulation, one of the effects is that we redirect blood flow from the areas that we don't really need a lot of blood flow in right now. So that would be like our visceral organs and digestion, reproduction. So any of the organs that aren't really relevant right now during this fight or flight state, we have vasoconstriction. So we reduce blood flow to those areas and we redirect that blood flow to our skeletal muscles that we're using for that activity and to our brain and our heart and lungs. So we're redirecting that blood flow to where it's more relevant so that we can think and act and have enough blood flow to our muscles to be able to fight or flee or do whatever we need to survive that situation. So exercise is one of the causes of a sympathetic nervous system activation. If we think about the E's, so exercise, excitement, embarrassment, and emergency, those are the 4 E's of sympathetic stimulation. So exercise is one of them. So we also vasoconstrict the vessels that are supplying muscles that we aren't really using right now. So we vasoconstrict to visceral organs and things that aren't very relevant to our fight or flight situation. And we vasoconstrict to the muscles that we're not really using so that we can vasodilate in the muscles that we are using and need to have sufficient blood flow. So we have to vasoconstrict and vasodilate in the correct places to maintain adequate peripheral resistance and therefore adequate blood pressure. So if we don't have enough vasoconstriction, if we have too much vasodilation throughout the body, then our peripheral resistance will drop and our blood pressure will drop and we won't be able to maintain adequate blood pressure to maintain consciousness and to sustain the level of activity that we are engaging in. So there's something called functional sympatholysis. So that's the inhibition of sympathetically mediated vasoconstriction in an active muscle as long as blood pressure is maintained. Okay, so under sympathetic stimulation, we want to vasoconstrict. Okay, so sympathetic stimulation causes vasoconstriction, but we want vasodilation to happen in the muscles that we're using. So functional sympatholysis, that is where we are inhibiting those sympathetic impulses to the blood vessels in those active muscles so that we can overcome that and allow for vasodilation to those specific muscles. So blood flow is more closely related to the metabolic rate of contractile activity than it is to the work performed. So regardless of the amount of work that we're actually performing, so think about like how much weight we're moving, how quickly, that sort of thing. So regardless of the work that we're performing, the blood flow that a muscle requires is related to its metabolic activity. So the metabolic rate of contractile activity as opposed to the actual work that's being performed. So in 2 individuals performing the same amount of work, they might have entirely different metabolic rates of contractile activity, which would mean that they would have a different amount of required blood flow to sustain that activity. Our blood flow is directed based on oxygen delivery. So our oxygen delivery is happening based on the oxygen demand of the tissue. So more oxygen demand leads to greater blood flow. And hemoglobin that is loaded with oxygen actually stimulates release of certain metabolites like nitric oxide, adenosine, prostaglandins, and other metabolites. And so those things help to stimulate more vasodilation locally in that muscle in response to the delivery of that oxygen-loaded hemoglobin. Okay, so AMP, activated protein kinase, that is abbreviated AMPK. And I know that's a mouthful, so let's break down what that actually is referring to. So AMP is adenosine monophosphate. So that's like ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has 3 phosphates. Adenosine diphosphate has 2 phosphates, and then adenosine monophosphate has 1 phosphate. So these are all very closely related compounds. It's just a matter of how many phosphates are stored in each compound, and therefore how much energy is stored. So when AMP levels are increasing, that means that we have been breaking down ADP and ATP. So we've been using it for energy. So when AMP levels are increasing, that means that the cell is hungry for energy. So we're low on energy because we have been using up our ATP, and now we have an increasing level of AMP. So AMP, activated protein kinase, is a kinase. That's an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to other molecules. So it's an enzyme that's activated by increasing amounts of AMP that are accumulating in the muscle cells. So it acts as a sensor molecule that detects the muscle energy state, kind of like a thermostat that's detecting the temperature in your house so that you can increase or decrease. The AMPK is detecting how much AMP is present, and so it can help regulate the use and production of ATP. So this particular kinase that's activated under conditions of metabolic stress, like exercise, is a great example. And so it's activated when the ratio of AMP to ATP rises. So our levels of AMP are going up relative to our levels of ATP, so it activates the AMPK. So it stimulates glucose uptake, which is favorable in terms of producing more ATP to reduce that ratio. And it's also involved in mitochondriogenesis, meaning genesis or creation of more mitochondria that occurs in response to training. And we will talk more about that in future videos. So the overall effect of activation of the AMPK is that it activates the pathways that generate ATP. So like bringing in more glucose, for example, and producing more mitochondria in response to training. And it inhibits pathways that consume ATP. Okay, so the action of AMPK is essentially to make the AMP to ATP ratio more favorable. So we're going to bring down the level of AMP and increase the level of ATP in the cell. Okay, so exercise, insulin, and glucose uptake. So the action of insulin is that insulin is secreted in response to increasing blood glucose levels. So the insulin goes around in the body and acts on the insulin receptors of the different cells, especially muscle cells, because it makes up a large proportion of our body's tissues, and they're very metabolically active. They need a lot of glucose. So the insulin goes to the cells and activates those insulin receptors, which facilitates the entry of glucose into those cells that the insulin is acting on. So we want insulin, we want our cells to be very sensitive to insulin, because that means that when we secrete insulin, the cells will very readily take glucose up from the bloodstream, which has two effects. It feeds the cell, so the cell gets the glucose that it needs to produce ATP and fuel its activities. And it also lowers blood glucose levels. Because when we eat carbohydrates and we have an increase in blood glucose, it comes back down when we secrete insulin and the cells bring the glucose out of the blood and into the cells. So it's going to regulate blood sugar and feed the cells. So we want to increase our sensitivity to insulin, especially in somebody who is insulin resistant, somebody who is overweight or obese, somebody who has type 2 diabetes. We want to increase our insulin sensitivity, and exercise does that. So moderate intensity exercise, and that goes for cardiovascular exercise and strength training, increases the sensitivity of the muscle cells to insulin, both during the session and after exercise. So especially if somebody is engaging in an ongoing exercise program, then overall the effect will be better insulin sensitivity, because if you're exercising frequently enough, then we maintain that benefit over time. So insulin resistance, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of information out there about what actually causes insulin resistance. It isn't clear, and it appears to be multifactorial. So there's a lot going on, which is why there's so much debate about the precise mechanisms that are causing insulin resistance. But there are a lot of different factors. And here I'm just discussing one small aspect of insulin resistance. So as I mentioned, skeletal muscle makes up a large proportion of the tissues in the body. So skeletal muscle it's especially important that skeletal muscle cells be sensitive to insulin, because they're responsible for consuming a lot of the glucose in circulation. So generally, when somebody becomes insulin resistant, it usually begins in the muscle cells, and it's largely a problem with muscle cell resistance to insulin, because it does make up such a large proportion of our tissue. So one factor that might be involved in insulin resistance is an imbalance between the fatty acid uptake of the cells and the oxidation of those fatty acids within the cells. So our muscle cells, all of our cells, but especially our muscle cells, they take up fatty acids, free fatty acids from the bloodstream. So we take up those fatty acids and we oxidize those and use them for energy. So that's just a normal part of our cellular metabolism that's taking place all the time. But it's a problem if cells are taking up a disproportionate amount of fatty acids from the blood compared to how many they're actually oxidizing. So if the muscle cells are taking up an excessive amount of fatty acids and they're not oxidizing them, they just kind of accumulate and they build up in the cells. And that buildup is thought to interfere with insulin signaling. So this particular problem is a combination of inactivity. So physical inactivity will lead the cells to not oxidize all the fatty acids that they're taking up because they don't need to. So if there isn't a great enough demand for energy, then they're not going to oxidize those fatty acids and use them for energy. So exercise helps with that problem, helps us to oxidize more. And then the other part of the problem is if people are eating kind of a poor diet. So it could be too high in fat, too high in carbohydrate. There's debate about which one is the problem, which is why high fat, low carbohydrate diets are thought to improve insulin resistance in spite of this issue. Because remember, there are many factors that play into insulin resistance and that factor in to how and why we take up fatty acids and how and why we oxidize and use them for an energy source. So insulin resistance is likely a combination of a problem with the overall diet that the person is taking in, and how that diet is incorrect is debated. And then that combined with inactivity. So the cell's demand for energy isn't as great as it could be. And Of course, as I mentioned, exercise also increases insulin sensitivity. So in spite of this fatty acid problem, if the cells are becoming more sensitive to insulin because of exercise, then that is also going to improve the condition. So on top of it simply increasing the sensitivity to insulin, exercise also increases the capacity for mitochondrial free fatty acid oxidation, which helps to reduce the buildup. Okay, so even though we might be taking in too many free fatty acids, the cells taking in too many from the blood, if we are exercising, it actually enhances the ability of the mitochondria to oxidize those free fatty acids and use them for energy, in addition to also increasing the insulin sensitivity. All right, that's all I have for you in this video. Thanks for watching.